don't think the police are gonna be looking for me?
No, Madalyn, I don't think anyone's gonna be looking for you.
Jack Ferguson.
You know Madalyn Murray O'Hair? She's disappeared.
I'm John MacCormack. I'm a reporter for the San Antonio Express News. And in 1996, I was assigned to look into the disappearance of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Madalyn Murray O'Hair was a formerly famous atheist who had achieved prominence in the early 60s when she filed a lawsuit alleging that school prayer and school Bible reading was unconstitutional. It was one of 3 suits filed in a short time frame in the early 60s. Hers was the third. They all 3 made the same legal claims, and the Supreme Court decided in favor of each one of them. However, O'Hair came out of all this as identified as being the one who had filed the most important suit, and she took advantage of it and basically became a professional atheist. And she appeared on talk shows. She established various atheist organizations, eventually settling in Austin, and she was quite prominent in the 60s and 70s. Well, the assignment was a casual mention by my then boss, Fred Bonavita, the state editor, that it had been a year since Madalyn Murray O'Hair had disappeared, and why didn't I check into things and see how the case was going. And I frankly wasn't even aware that she had disappeared because there was no commotion made, no police complaints filed, nothing when she disappeared. The organization just kept it very, very mum. So I didn't know she was gone, and I knew very little about her at that time. Well, there were about 80 to 100 stories over 3 years, and about 5 of them really mattered. The first one was just laying out that she was gone, and I met a few critical sources who would come back to help me later. But it didn't go very far, and no one had any idea whether she had fled to the South Seas with atheist money, or whether she'd been captured by the Crisis or the CIA or the Vatican, as various theories were floating around. In November of 1996, I looked at the 990 forms filed by several of her atheist organizations, and they revealed that some $600,000 had disappeared at about the same time as the O'Hairs had disappeared. So when you add a lot of money into the plot of disappeared persons, it gets more interesting. The next big development was that I was approached by a private investigator named Tim Young, who proposed that we collaborate because his specialty was finding people who didn't want to be found, and he frankly thought it would be rather easy to find them. He and I worked together about 19 months, and then we had a disagreement over which direction to go in. But in that time, we learned a great deal. The most critical breakthrough for us came in June of 1998, when I got an anonymous call from someone who basically told me that the O'Hairs had been killed and that another party named Danny Fry had disappeared with them. By this time, we were pretty much working the theory that they were dead, because Tim Young had been able to find no sign of life anywhere on the globe. So with the introduction of Danny Fry, who was kind of an alcoholic, low-life con man from Florida, into the plot, and the fact that he had disappeared, this really made things more interesting. It was in this phone call that we were told to pay attention to a guy named David Waters, who was an ex-con who had worked for the O'Hairs a few years earlier, had stolen about $50,000 from them, and O'Hair had pressed the case against Waters, and he had been convicted, and she'd also devoted an entire issue of the American Atheist newsletters to David Waters and his horrific, shameful past, because he had done some very, very bad things in his past. So now we had a very, including being convicted of murder. So now we had a murderer, we had 4 disappeared people, we had $600,000 gone somewhere. So it was beginning to get much more serious for Tim Young and I. And in August of '98, Tim Young and I had a split. He felt that it was his duty as a private investigator to go to the police with the information we had, because we had a pretty coherent theory now. And I had no confidence in the police, I'm speaking of the Austin police, who had pretty much ignored the case. They treated it as a voluntary disappearance by a person, which isn't a crime. So Tim and I, had not acrimonious, but it was an unfriendly split. I decided I was going to keep reporting. He went to the Austin police. They ignored him, and then from then on, I worked alone. In October of '98, I happened across a small story that was generated by AP in Dallas, based on a morning news story about the third anniversary of the discovery of a nude, headless, handless body beside the Trinity River. It had been found in, obviously in October, I think it was October of '95. And I just somehow, fortunately, thought to myself, that's the same weekend that Danny Fry disappeared. And, you know, why not? So, make a long story short, I tried to exclude Danny Fry from being that person. I called his relatives and I got a description of the torso and the size and the shoe size and body hair patterns, and nothing could exclude him. So I called the sheriff's office in Dallas County and I said, look, I might know who your missing guy is. And they'd invested hundreds of hours and hundreds of missing persons reports trying to find out who this was. So they were kind of cautious about talking to me, but they wanted to do it. So I flew up there and we all sat in a little room and I walked them through the O'Hair disappearance, and to them it was like science fiction. But eventually they came to see that there was a possibility that this headless, handless guy might be my Danny Fry, who had disappeared in Texas after coming from Florida. So that was a big, big development because they didn't laugh me off or anything. They took me seriously. Danny Fry's relatives weren't the type that were comfortable with police, so I got 3 of his relatives to contribute blood samples, and the lab tested it all, and voila, in January of '99, it turns out that the headless, handless body was Danny Fry, and that pretty much closed the door on the O'Hairs being alive anywhere. So I wrote another story, and by this time I had a lot more information from phone records I had acquired. So I wrote another story basically laying out the picture of them being taken to San Antonio. Danny Fry's with the O'Hairs. He's making calls from the same places, you know, that they're known to be, and he's dead. So ergo they're likely dead. And this really inspired the FBI to get involved. So they threw a lot of manpower at it. And within a couple of months, they'd arrested David Waters, and they'd arrested a second ex-con named Gary Carr, who was a real cold-blooded snake. And so the FBI got involved hardcore, and then the story proceeded from there. At this point, the only thing that was really missing, the critical component, was proof of their deaths. It's hard to prosecute someone for murder when you don't have a body. So that hung over the case for a long time. That no one knew where the bodies were. Waters wouldn't tell, and Carr tried to show them, but he took them out to the hill country, but he couldn't find the body, so it was sort of a stalemate. David Waters decided basically it was over. He was in state custody on a state offense, and he made a deal with the feds that if they put him in federal prison, which is apparently it's a lot nicer place than state prison, that he would cooperate, and that was the deal they cut. So Waters gave a very long statement describing everything, and eventually also walked them out there and said, there's the spot, and they dug, and they found the bodies. There were many reporters out there that day, and they kind of knew they had Madalyn Murray O'Hair when they turned up a titanium false artificial hip, and the DNA test proved that these were the bodies of the 3 O'Hairs plus Danny Fry's head and hands, all buried in the same hole. And that kind of brought things to an end. The final chapter of the whole story was an interesting one because Madalyn Murray O'Hair's first son, Bill Murray, turned away from atheism and became a very devout Christian, and he was kind of at philosophical war with his mother for the rest of his life, but he honored her wishes and to not have a religious ceremony at her burial, and so they buried them near Austin without any priests or ministers or religious components, which was frankly a very respectful thing, for your mother, even if you think she's going to hell. I was impressed by that. Well, as a newspaper reporter, most stories are short-lived and you never really figure everything out, and it ends up, you're just further into the murk. With this story, it went on for 3 years. I wrote 80 to 100 stories, and it kept getting better and better and better the longer we pushed and searched. I mean, not every day. There were long periods of no progress, but at the end of the day, we managed to take a complete mystery. Everything was confused, and we pulled it all the way into the sunlight where you had a clear idea. I mean, it was not an idea. You had a clear story of what happened, and it solved a very complex murder case, which doesn't happen every day. So it was very satisfying. But I don't confuse it with more important reporting about social issues. This was just a whodunit that was just a hell of a lot of fun to report. A lot of work and at the end of the day, very satisfying.